I will say when I was young, I did a lot of drawing because back then I feel like I didn't really know how to express myself. And I feel like a lot of artists, when they're young, go down this road of art is the only way that they can express themselves because they can't necessarily do it in speech or in dance or in any kind of interpretation. Maybe some can. There's a lot of ways how they can intersect. But for me, it was drawing in a sketchbook.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Set Listing Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson, and tonight we are doing one of those, we're off the Bruce train. We are talking to a musician, a writer, another podcaster. And so I'm sure Bruce will come up because he always does. But this is one of those, as we call our B side episodes. Sebastian, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So Shug, how do you say your last?
No, you're exactly right. And you were one of the first, if not the first, podcast host to actually get my name right.
Well, thank you. I now think you're like that isn't really how to say it, but I'm gonna
No,
make
no, no,
it
no.
because he feels good.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
Sebastian Schug, it's German, and people assume that it's pronounced Schug, like shoe on your
yeah.
foot. But no, yeah, it's very that language is full of just guttural, low-sounding vowels anyway. So,
So you know what makes me think of this, Sebastian? And I don't. You're probably not old enough, but you may have seen it on reruns. Is the great sitcom Barney Miller, and
oh yeah, I've heard of it.
yeah. So one of the characters is Polish, and it's uh, Wajaholis, and
Hmm.
it's like, how do you spell it? Just like it sounds. and so and so I'm looking at yours like, well, it's Shug, like
Yeah.
it's sh and hug. So that's why I was like, so it was easy for me. So why don't you tell us a little about yourself? Give us your elevator pitch.
All right. Well, my elevator pitch unfortunately has gone through a few rehashes in these past couple of months, and I will quickly give you the TLDR version of it. So, first things first, I started off as a freelance illustrator, illustrating children's books, quickly moved on into writing and then into publishing, and did that for about 5 to 6 years. COVID knocked on everyone's door and said, "Hey, I'm here. Let me introduce myself," and essentially shut down small businesses worldwide, including mine, Sebastian Schug Publishing. I used to publish lowbrow satire among other genres. I just thought it was funny. So if you want me to answer that question, there you go. But yeah, ever since then, I attempted to put all of my sort of creation under one umbrella, which was Sebastian Schug Publishing. And while the business is now, closed until further notice, my projects still remain. Now, do I still write? Do I still make music? Do I still illustrate? Of course. It's just not in the entrepreneurial aspect that once was, so to speak.
You know, I'm gonna. This is a horrible metaphor, but I remember, and I every time someone talks about being creative, there was a one of my favorite writers when I was younger in high school was Isaac Asimov, and the science fiction writer. And
Hmm.
he, there's another story I tell about him all the time in the podcast, but he wrote a short story set in the future where um, basically the idea was you put on what we would call now 3D glasses and you watched films and you watched, and they called it something else. And And the short story was basically a day with the creative, like an executive producer, head of a dream network.
Hmm.
And one of the characters was a writer who was tired. He said, I'm drained, I don't have enough. And the executive says, look, here's your contract, I'm tearing it up, you get out of here. And
Oh,
and the premise at the very end, he's talking to someone and they said, wow, that's a really bad day. And he goes, I had 3 meetings today. One I think went okay, one I'm worried about, but this is the one I'm least worried about, because creative people can't stop creating.
yeah,
And
exactly.
so what I just needed to do was to free him from the responsibility of thinking he has to create.
Hmm.
And he says, and I know he will be back because he can't stop doing what he does.
That is a very interesting perspective on it, because I'll just kind of go into sort of a personal aside.
I told you we go off on tangents in
No, no,
this
no.
show.
It's great, because this is another first for me. I did not look at it like that, because at the time when COVID was really hitting its stride and I thought, okay, all was lost, that's all what was on my mind. All was lost. And the fact of the matter is, because I dabbled in satire, I was also worried on the back burner of copyright infringement. Now, I never did anything wrong in terms of that, and as it goes for writing satire, you walk that fine line of, fair use and its commentary. What could be the legal ramifications, right? And I'm knocking on wood here, because even though I didn't do anything wrong in the era of COVID, I can see why people would go after every last red cent that someone has. We're a very litigious society, and,
Yes,
and I
absolutely.
despise that. So that, coupled with the fact that at the end of the day, people weren't buying books, that was what unfortunately led to my independent publishing company's closure. And in that meantime was when I started to reach out to more podcast hosts, not to promote myself, because I feel like a lot of people end up doing that at the end of the day. I'm guilty of it myself in the earlier days, but having a new perspective of, okay, where do you go from here as a creator? And I got to tell you, this episode, this conversation in particular, I could tell it's going to be a great one, because music was what really led me out of that funk.
Eh,
Like, where do I go from here kind of thing.
Well, and yeah, and I'm really looking forward to talking about that. And what I'm finding, and so I started this, and my listeners, I apologize. This is, you skip ahead, hit your skip button a couple of times. But I, I just wanted to. Lynette Carolla, Adam Carolla's wife, did 4 or 5 episodes where she talked to friends of hers and Adam's that were Bruce fans and shared their stories, including Phil Rosenthal, who everyone loves, Raymond, created that show.
Hmm.
And he talked about how much he loved Bruce. And they did not talk about their celebrity; they just talked about their fandom. And I thought that was amazing. And I'm like, I want more of these. So, in the spirit of lighting a candle instead of cursing the darkness, I went to the guy who runs our network and I said, hey, Rob, I want to do a Springsteen podcast. And he goes, okay. And we just recently talked about this. Um, he looked at his wife and says, hey, Jesse's going to do a Bruce Springsteen podcast. I think we'll get a year out of it. And he says, and really, that's all he wants. He says, if I can get 12 to 24 episodes, if I can get 1 episode a month or 2 a month from a show, I'm happy, right? Because
Hmm.
podcasts don't always last.
Right.
He said, you're now 5+ years, 600 episodes,
Wow.
and um, and what's happened over the years, Sebastian, is I found that what I really, yes, I love talking Bruce Springsteen, and I
Hmm.
love discussing how his music affected people's lives, and how he's been, to quote him, a constant companion on this part of the ride. But what I really do is love talking to people who are passionate about almost anything. And so, as the way you and I met, there are Facebook pages where it says, be a guest,
Right.
find a guest. And about once a month, every 6 weeks, I go into that and I go, I host a music podcast. If you want to join me to show to promote your podcast, if you can talk about music at all, even a little bit, I can squeeze you into my format and basically have fun. And so I'm so glad you're here and I'm glad you want to share. I am going to know, would what kind of children's book did you illustrate?
Sure. So the children's series is it's called The Adventures of Daniel. It was like I said, it's a very independent series.
Hmm.
Again, I did not write the book. The original author's name is Renee Gazarian.
Okay.
So if you'd like to check that out, those are the only books of mine that are still available for purchase.
Okay.
So when I did sort of the great purge, if you will, of
Hmm.
my publishing company, those were the books that were left because at the end of the day, that was my first ever
Yeah.
contracted project that I ever worked on. You can still find all of my old titles, still floating around out there. But I think for all intents and purposes, you can't purchase them. They're just kind of archived.
Okay.
So yeah,
All right. That's interesting. Um, so I always like to start at the beginning, and so talk about where did you grow up, and I'll broaden this in your term, not just as music, but was artistic endeavors like writing and drawing and making music or listening to music part of your growing up?
very much.
Okay.
Very much so. It's a broad question, definitely, and I unfortunately I could only answer it broad. But I grew up, basically doodling in sketchbooks. When you're a kid, 12, 13, 14-year old, drawing and making designs, and you have no idea what the hell commission is or how to get paid for your work, rather. It's something that you inevitably have to learn if you want to survive as an artist. And coupled with the fact that when I got my first illustration gig, I was 15 years old. Admittedly, the vanity of it started to kind of take hold because it's like, oh, well, I think I'm hot stuff because I'm the only one doing this. There weren't a lot of people even contributing to my high school's newspaper back then in like the little cartoonist section. So every single element that I could, strut my stuff and show off back in the day, it was, yeah, no, I loved it. I'm not going to say that I reveled in the attention uh for 16, 17, 18. I feel like I was, still fairly modest, but it's easy to let that get to your head. And rather than letting it be my downfall, I sort of had it snowball where, this is, I'm liking the enthusiasm because my enthusiasm for it in getting these projects, independent, larger, whatever, people would start to notice it. And that kickback, it would encourage me to do more and more and more. So I guess you could say that I was chasing a sort of high, a creative high, and I wanted to uh, I wanted to encompass more mediums that I haven't tried yet. Back then, for me, it was animation, right? And then I
Yeah.
decided, well, I don't want to do animation, but I still know the fundamentals of it. Let me work on illustration. It's a lot more static, but I can still tell a story,
Hmm.
So
Did did you always know that you wanted to do something with drawing as a living?
when I was young, yes.
Okay.
Though I will say, when I was young, I did a lot of drawing because back then I feel like I didn't really know how to express myself, and I feel like a lot of artists when they're young go down this road of art is the only way that they can express themselves because they can't necessarily do it in speech or in dance or in any kind of interpretation. Maybe some can. There's a lot of ways how they can intersect, but for me it was drawing in a sketchbook.
Okay.
when I began to really become more outspoken and fall in love with public speaking and communication, that is when I realized that, okay, while I love drawing and that will be something that I will forever cherish, it does not have to be mutually exclusive. This is the be all end all career for me.
It That's interesting. I've told this story multiple times. I have a dear friend. I think of as a brother named Tom Zoller, who lives in Ohio, and he published um, a comic book called Love and Capes, and he ended up doing 4 volumes of it on a trade paperback, and then he did um, for webtoons a a couple of series, Warning Label and Cupid's Arrow. Warning
Mm-hmm.
Label was especially funny because the premise is um, this a young woman has a curse that anytime someone asks her out, the guy immediately gets a list of all the things that's wrong with her as a warning label and why
Mm.
you should not date her. And in the first couple of issues, you determine you can take things off that warning label if you work through certain things. So it ends up being a very romantic story. And Tom's a gifted writer and a gifted artist, but he says from the moment he picked up a crayon, he knew that's the only thing he wanted to do with his life. Like,
Interesting.
yeah, I mean,
Okay.
that's the only thing he ever wanted to do. Uh, he got a scholarship to go to college, and instead he went to Joe Kubert's, art school
Wow.
because he knew he wanted to work in comics. So that
Mm-hmm.
was, and so I think that's interesting that you didn't have the same call, even though you knew that art would always be part of your life. You were open to doing other things artistic. Were you ever did you ever think, well, what I really want to do is go sell insurance? And I don't mean that literally, but like joining business world, you always wanted to do something in the arts?
There was a time, and I think it's slowly transitioning into not so much me being the boring desk office guy, but more so along the lines of, okay, how do I find a practical means to fund my creativity? And I think a lot of people end up thinking that getting that position, this menial occupation that is, an office space job is like selling your soul to the devil. You didn't take the risk, you didn't jump the hoops, you couldn't say that you grinded 24/7 to pursue an artistic career. When really, I think that that's pretty inconsiderate to the person working his butt off at this job in order to fund it. I feel like a lot of people aren't willing to see sort of the backstage element of that. So as I'm getting older, I will admit I have dabbled in the thought of, I guess you could say, quote unquote, settling temporarily. I'm not hitting the lottery anytime soon. Let's just be real.
Sure.
The stock market's low last time I checked, and every single investment that I've ever made, that you could deem as an asset is down. I have a long time
Yeah.
of investing and waiting to do. So, as of now, in the era of COVID still, where people need money more than ever, what do you do? Well, you have to kind of find ends meet at this point. And whether it be that menial position or whether it be a stroke of good fortune brought upon by legitimate or illegitimate connections, I hope I don't fall in the latter, but needless to say, it happens to people. Um, you just kind of have to take it in strides and do the best thing possible at that moment.
So first off, you're bringing up something that I think is very timely, and we'll take our first foray into Springsteen land.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite songs of his is a song that is called Better Days. And the song starts out, well, my soul checked out missing as I sat listening to the hours and minutes ticking away. Yeah, just sitting around waiting for my life to begin while it was all just slipping away. I'm tired of waiting for tomorrow to come or that train to come roaring round the bend. I've got a new set of clothes, a pretty red rose, and a woman I can call my friend.
That's
And
poetic.
and you know, I said I think this is more than just romance. I think it, and I've talked about this often. th-
It's more wanderlust than
yeah,
anything because a lot of people, when they get their first semblance of, I want to say, fame, and I'm not, I can only look at this in hindsight
right.
because, analyzing lyrics, analyzing text, I mean, that's essentially what I went to school for, and I'm not trying to put
Yeah,
a chip on my own shoulder saying that. But when I look at this, the metaphor is, well, we're going to die anyway. And there's no point spending time waiting around wishing or regretting what could have been when you can just go and take that risk. Now, I will say,
yes,
sort of in retort, I don't think people can get away with doing that now as opposed to 10, 15, maybe 20 years ago. And I think that's just a changing climate of what society has deemed a necessary risk, because you can come here to Los Angeles or New York or really any major metropolitan area thinking that you can make a go of it in a new city to be an artist. And admittedly, I will say, have these delusions of grandeur. Um, but until you find a way to actually fund it and, have a good game plan, you know, what then, kind of thing.
well, and I couple things, right? Like in my mind, the song is um, "Better Days is Today," and I've talked about this often. That too many people say, "Well, when I get enough nest egg, then
Mm-hmm.
I'll be happy. If I get the kids out of diapers, then I'll be happy. When I get enough nest egg, then I'll start working on my novel or then doing
Right.
things." And, my life is it. You enjoy the moment and the journey, and you don't wait for tomorrow. You embrace today, and that doesn't mean you don't plan for the future and doesn't do anything. But just the idea is you enjoy where you're at now, even though you're planning. The other
Uh,
thought, go ahead,
well,
please.
I was going to say it's very interesting because the second paragraph outlines that touch of realism where it says, and I understand the disclaimer that we had at the beginning of the show, not to curse, but I'm going to
Yeah.
try my
No,
best.
please. No, go ahead.
Where it says, well, I took a piss at Fortune's sweet kiss. It's like eating caviar and dirt. It's sad, funny ending to find yourself pretending a rich man in a poor man's shirt. And
Yes.
I won't read the rest for sake of,
Yeah.
advertiser revenue or
Yeah.
PG. But basically, I think a lot of artists hoodwink themselves into believing that image is
Yeah.
everything.
And the question I think all the time is when is drive? When is ambition? When is in believing yourself? Do you cross the line where you're just being unrealistic? Everyone loves the story of someone that they kept working at their art, they kept toiling, they got, Brad Meltzer tells the story, that his first novel was rejected, and I'm going to get the number wrong, but by 11, he got 11 rejecting letters. There was only 10 publishing house. He got rejected by one twice, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and as he tells that story, and later he became published, you hear all the stories about people who keep fighting, 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 and then finally
Right.
you get success. Well, when do you go over from ambition and believing yourself to delusional? And I'm not saying you settle, but I think there's and once again, there's this beautiful song on Bruce's Devils and Dust where Jesus was an only son. And it's the song from Mary's perspective of Jesus. And when he did this live, he stopped kind of in the middle and he kept playing the piano. And he said, "You wonder if Jesus sits there and go, there's this little bar down in Galilee that's for sale, and I could pick that up. I could marry Mary Magdalene. We could have a few kids, and I could say preaching for the weekend. you know, like we could have a good life.
Right.
And he said, and the punchline is, it's the humanity that truly brings the power of this redemption story. So, um, is there a and is there a way to have, and I believe there is a way to have a wonderful life, that and a good life, and you can find a way to stretch your creative muscles, yet at the same time be a responsible, parent or
Right.
spouse or sibling. um
Well, really, being a responsible artist, I mean, you see some of the longevity of these artists, they piss away their fortune, so to
yes.
speak. They make it big once,
Hmm.
and in essence, they think that, sky's the limit. This high is never going to, this train is never going to come to the station. It's always going to go full throttle. And it's
Yeah.
like at the end of the day, you have to stop. Some of these artists die from taking it too far, especially in the music industry. So I can't even imagine how people would, how people could just carry on as if nothing's happening, as if their popularity isn't getting the better of them.
Yeah, there's two stories I have heard about Fred Berry, the guy
Mhm.
who was on What's Happening, the '70s sitcom. He played Rerun.
Right.
And the two stories are, the first, um, in the casting notes, they were looking for this skinny, kind of awkward white kid to play Raj's friend. And when Fred Berry came in, he blew them away so much that they rewrote the script to cast him. So this is a story I have been told by many people, that agents tell them, like, hey, if you're good enough in the audition, you can make this part your own. The other
Mm.
story is that Fred Berry, in What's Happening, only happened 64 episodes, only 2 or 3 years, got so important and so thought of himself, blew through all his money, thought he was more important than he was, and had a very tragic career. So, two eyes, two kind of sides of the coin. And yeah, I think you have to be appreciative when you get the success, and continue to work for it, but also understand that you know there are there are very few people that are going to be, and I know this is like Bob Dylan, right? You're not going to
Mm.
be Bob Dylan, where it's still in the in the 2000s, you're getting a Nobel Prize, and
Right.
and you're still putting out great music.
That's where expectations really need to fall in line, because you look at someone like, Bob Dylan for one, but let's just say the Beatles for another,
Yeah,
a band that could tackle any genre and set the bar while they were at it, right?
yeah,
And people go into it, let's just say, like, well, I'm going to sound so not intelligent asking this, but Beatles was like classic rock, right?
yeah. That's what. Yeah, you would.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So
We could
so
do that. Yeah,
so the genre isn't exactly dead, but let's just say you have an artist tackling a genre that has had a history of success, going into that with the expectations of, well, people are going to like my work because, I mean, hell, look at who's been signed, look at who's made a lot of money, kind of thing.
yeah,
Only to find out when they come to LA, New York, what have you, moving from that small town city of selling out because that's what their population was, very little, they find out that they can't sell a single album or a single record or, you know, digital EP in the 21st century.
yeah.
So the expectations, it nosedives some artists.
Yeah, and it is such a unfair lottery business. There are, you know, hundreds, if not thousands, of people that are incredibly gifted, that are incredibly talented. And Mark Evanier told the story. Mark Evanier is a very successful comic book writer, TV writer. He worked on Welcome Back, Kotter. He was the executive producer and head writer for the Garfield um, animated cartoon series that lasted forever. Right?
Mhm.
He, he spent a lot of times working on the Sid and Croft like variety shows of the 70s. But anyway, Mark has written in all kinds of known Hollywood, known other these things, and he tells the story. He says that there were two stand-up comedians, both equally talented, both equally amazing, and one gets a gig and it's a guest star spot, and it gets him a little bit of attention, and next thing you know, he's on a sitcom, and the sitcom gets his fire, and all of a sudden he has this career and he's incredibly successful. The other stand-up comedian, just as funny, just as talented, just as nice a guy, never catches that break and continues just to, kind of go through what you would call a journeyman's career.
Mhm.
The business isn't fair.
Right.
And there are people that write beautiful novels that people don't read.
Mhm.
And that doesn't, and, and so that I go back to the question, when is pursuing your dream become unhealthy? And I don't know, it's not my time to say that. It's not,
Right.
you can't say that, but I think you have to have that discussion yourself to know, okay, is it time for me to do something else, or can I find a compromise, as you talked about, a a day gig to get me through, and I'll
Mhm.
work through this other, um, hoping for better days.
Right. I think also in regards to like a day gig or like a secondary hobby or, whatever happens to fund the artistic path, I think people also don't understand the correlation between having a job or having a career that you are actually content with and its benefits of distancing yourself from the art itself, right? So I would talk to a plethora of artists in college and even high school back when they wanted to start. And they, flat out told me if you aren't working on your art, 24/7, if you aren't hustling, grinding, and, many other synonyms that I've grown to despise over the
Yeah.
years, because honestly, it just implies that you have so big of an ego that you are not willing to go outside and venture into the other possibilities of what your life may contain other than your art, which you think is great. So that becomes a vicious cycle in and of itself. But the benefits of walking away from a project, I don't think people really have grasped the importance of that. Like, it's okay to walk away from it and it's okay to reroute yourself, but people have it in their minds where it's just like if you're not working on your projects, then you're wasting time.
Yeah, and
And
you never,
that's unhealthy.
there is unhealthy, and you never know where that inspiration may come. One of my favorite stories is, they were interviewing, the um, mothers of a couple of pro quarterbacks, and they talked to Troy Aikman's mother,
Mhm.
and and she was saying, well, I believe the reason why Troy is so good is that after the game, um, in the car, we would not let him talk about the game. We would talk about his sister's
Mhm.
games, and we would talk about other things, but we would not discuss anything at all. And I think that distance he had and that ability for him to think about other things is one of the reasons why he was really good. Okay. They talked to
Right.
John Elway's mother. John Elway's mom goes, I think the reason why John was so good is that in the car on the way home, his dad and him would go over every play and they would talk about everything because his dad was a coach and they would discuss it and they would spend time truly to the minuscule about his career. And I
Yeah.
think that
Like
way John's,
honing. Yeah.
yeah.
Like honing
So,
his craft.
so I think that why John is so good. Okay. Both Hall of Fame quarterbacks, both divergent ways of being raised. And the answer is if you're a Hall of Fame quarterback, it's going to be hard for you to screw it up, right?
Right.
And so I think if the talent is there, and you may not get your big break, but if the talent is there, whether you spend it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, I think is unhealthy. Or if you find a somewhat healthy mix, or you go, um, you you go if you're struggling with a story and you go paint or you exercise or you go spend time with your kids or go to dinner with your friends and like, okay, we don't want to talk about this now, your subconscious may work on that problem you're having, and you may come back and go, oh, that's it. That was the key I was missing to finish this plot twist.
Right.
Wait, we've gotten heavy all of a sudden, Sebastian.
I
I
mean, you said that this show was full of tangents, and to tell you the truth, I'm having fun.
Well, good. I'm glad. Um, I did want to talk about you. You did say that as you were doing COVID and you're going, music was something that really, and I'm using my words, not you, but a life preserver,
Yes.
a a a oasis. Talk to me a little bit about that.
So, well, you hit the nail right on the head. I will say before it was a life preserver, it was actually an anchor.
Okay.
In the beginning, because I was very much interested. I was in the mindset of still continuously tackling new mediums, and music was next on the chopping block. Not so much to get another notch on my belt, but in essence to see if I can do it.
Okay.
Now, I'm going to put this all out on the table, for sake of not only brevity but humility as well. I feel like as an artist, you can make a myriad of mistakes, and I certainly have. And quite possibly one of my biggest mistakes was in the field of music because I was unaware of the, I guess, particular morality issues of it. And I will go into that. Trust me,
Okay.
I'm not trying
Okay.
to speak in hindsight here.
No, no, no. I understand.
I began, as I think any fan of music naturally does, sampling tracks, editing them in a certain way, making them, maybe a lower tempo, and to sort of understand the genre of what I am tackling or what I currently tackle. It is the alternative lo-fi beat, you could say. I'm not
Hmm.
sure if you've heard of the genre. It's essentially just songs at a lower BPM. Maybe you
Okay.
put in a few, reverbs in there. It's slowed down, but it's this very calming melody that a bunch of indie musicians attempt, and they do it quite well. I began sampling songs. All right, I didn't sample songs from big name artists or anything like that. Even though, and I will get into why this is ironic in a bit, even though the internet, I will say this, the internet is a great place to share information, but it's also a great place to crack down on what isn't yours. So when you have something that sounds remotely similar, or whether it be in music, in film, in illustration and writing, there is a copyright system in place to fight back against that. These particular types of songs that other artists were utilizing, they were from artists like Michael Jackson was one. Oh God, so many. I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
Yeah, it's not coming to mind,
But I understand what your point. There
but
are
you know what I mean.
people,
Like there
yeah,
is
sampling huge acts.
huge acts, predominantly from the '80s, because that was when sort of the I mean, you're older than I am. You know, the funk genre, if you will,
Sure, absolutely.
sounds nice when it's slowed and reverbed.
Right.
Anyways, I decided that I was not going to go that route. I was going to sample other artists that weren't signed, but were rather royalty free, that were non copyrighted material. And I got in my head, okay, this must be fine, considering that if it's not copyrighted material, anyone could theoretically use it. So that's what I did. I used it. They sounded great. I submitted these. I'm not selling my work at this point. I'm actually shopping around for independent labels, and one actually contacted me, and I am signed with them still to this day. I'll get into that.
Yeah.
Trust me, I'm building this up
No, 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 you're good.
into, yeah. But after a few months of doing this, I quickly realized that this was not a fruitful endeavor. And I realized that because multiple artists actually came forward and told me point blank, this is not okay to do. Now, when you have it in your head of people have sampled since the beginning of music's existence, let alone have gotten away with it with bigger names and bigger labels, how is what I'm doing so bad? Now,
Right.
that attitude quickly changed from justification to, well, they're right. Because at the end of the day, these were independent artists, and that was a much, much bigger minefield to play around in. Because while ironically bigger labels would give you a slap on the wrist, these little independent artists would threaten me with lawsuits and everything
Hmm.
like that.
Sure.
And that was something that I wasn't prepared for. That was something I didn't want to deal with. And music to me at the time, it wasn't worth wasting my life over,
Right.
legally at least. So the label told me about it. They were confused, like, yeah, people have sampled since the dawn of time, but we're just gonna go ahead and delete it. We're still gonna keep your contract. And I'm like, okay, great. I didn't touch music for months. I was terrified of it. I was terrified at stepping on other people's toes. Okay. I was terrified at even the chance of doing something wrong, that people were to be like, look, this isn't yours.
Hmm.
And at the end of the day, it, the paranoia snowballed into a point where it's like, well, anyone could play the drums, anyone could play the guitar or the flute. These instruments aren't copyrighted material, but the sounds coming out of them potentially could be.
Yeah,
You kind of understand what I'm saying?
I
Like
do.
so fast forward a couple of months, it's now the new year. This all took place in, I want to say, end of October going into November. So now it's January 2021, and I decide, look, I only have one life to live, so I may as well attempt it again. I download GarageBand. Most people would say that GarageBand is pretty dinky. They'd probably go off and use something like FL Studio or Ableton or some other uh, what is it? Audio workspace digital. There's a particular acronym for it.
Okay.
GarageBand is on the lower end, you could say. Beginners utilize it, and I started utilizing it. I started utilizing the royalty free loops that they had. I started implementing my own sort of pitch shifts and everything, and slowly but surely it regained my confidence of, yeah, this is something that I could definitely I could do, and I could make it sound good. And what's more, I could put it out there for people to see. Now, of course, that came with its own fair share of inner struggles, inner complications of, well, is this okay to do? Am I allowed to legally sell songs made out of non-copyrighted material? Because I went down this path before. I'm not looking to go down it again for the negative repercussions.
Sure.
Um, thankfully it is all sound and above board. You just can't, like take a loop, like a loop on its own, and try to sell that.
Okay.
Obviously, you have to put them in some sort of composition. And ever since then, I mean, there's been no hiccups. Again, I knock on wood, but the music community, as interesting and as experimental as it can be, I'm also going to say point blank, it's one of the most toxic communities I think I've ever been a part of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I bet you didn't expect that right hook there, but
No, no, I get it.
yeah, it is forget about the whole money making aspect of it. It is just it's ruthless. It really
Yeah.
is. It gets to the point sometimes where you even debate with yourself of like, well, if there's so many roadblocks, how is it fun being an artist?
Yeah. That is
You
a
know,
great question. And what is your thoughts?
my thought is that while art isn't necessarily fun in an entrepreneurial aspect, because at the end of the day, if you're doing art, it's not the way it used to be where people create for the sole purpose of they were genuinely inspired to create it. I feel like a lot of art nowadays has to adhere to a specific agenda. This is not going to be a political discussion, trust me, but I feel
Yeah.
like a lot of art is commissioned to portray a certain perspective.
Hmm.
The genuineness to create a piece out of one's own inner ambition may very well still be there, but there's a more sinister backing to it.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it is about money. It is about the livelihood of the continuation of the medium for a specific artist. And if an artist point blank doesn't have funding, they're not going to be able to do it. At least to the extent of continuously putting their art out there. After all, when agents sign an actor to their casting agency, they are expectant that that actor is going to make them money as a percentage,
Sure.
right? So if you're noticed to a degree and you are represented, that kickback needs to still be expected. You still need to be putting out particular content that people enjoy that brings in dollars.
Yeah. Do do you I mean it's do are you enjoying doing this? Because it does sound like it, and a lot of
Oh,
times,
very much.
okay, you
Yeah,
this
no,
is still fun for
yeah.
you.
Oh, yeah, no, 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 no. Please don't confuse that with me being cynical towards it.
No,
I've
no,
had
no.
my fair share of cynical thoughts of like, well, at the end of the day, if there are this many, if it is a minefield, why would I knowingly and willingly walk into a minefield? You wouldn't,
Yes.
right? But
Right.
artists still do it anyway because the need to create it can be fulfilling, and it is fulfilling. Obviously artists aren't going to stop just because you tell them to.
Hmm.
So you make do with the environment around you, and I guess to a more extreme extent you suffer the consequences for it. You go to jail, or you hell, I know some artists that are dead. A
Hmm.
lot of
Yeah.
artists that are dead for because they stood for what they believed in. So
Hmm. Do what we didn't talk about this. You talked immediately when growing up, loving art and loving writing, but you didn't talk about what were music people that influenced you? What were bands or artists that you loved?
I think a lot like people growing up, their music tastes differ.
Sure.
I went through my standalone phase of, loving video games as a kid. So I would listen to a lot of, chip tune and techno. Growing up, going into, my moody phase, I listened to a lot of Green Day, My Chemical Romance, and, you know, God, Death Cab for Cutie. It just gave me
Hmm.
flashbacks. Starting to grow up a lot more, introduced to classic rock, and then hoodwinking myself into believing that, oh, I can play an instrument. Now, I can to some degree. I still like to focus myself into more so the electronic aspect of it, working from a computer. Um, but yeah, it's just I can't really easily answer that question other than a wide genre dependent on my age.
Well, what about electronic and the compute music from a computer? Why does do you can you explain why that spoke to you?
Sure. When I first was introduced to the lo-fi genre, this was music that, I'm not sure if you've listened to it yourself, but upon first listen, it is very heavily computer edited. And you'd think
Okay.
to yourself, well, that must not sound very good. because there's only so much that you can do with a classic instrument. A lot of it takes skill to learn and even more to master. So you'd think to yourself automatically, well, it must not take that much skill in a computer. Most of it's built in anyway, and you can change pitches and shifts and hats, snares, and claps on a dime. And you can, yes, you would admittedly think that it's easier to compose a track.
Hmm.
Is it? Well, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Obviously, you can accomplish many different genres electronically. Again, that's besides the point. Lo-fi for me was a genre that was very easy to get into. Its subgenre, or I will say its parent genre, vaporwave, or sister genre, whatever, vaporwave. The slow melodic trance ness of it. It was just it's what hooked me onto very somber forms of art and expression. Now I can enjoy a good classical piece as much as the next guy, but I don't know, something about this really spoke to me in just composition
Hmm.
overall, how a piece can be edited to an extent, to all hell and still sound good. And I think what's more, just how it can be improved from there. Like I said, a lot of these vaporwave lo-fi pieces are sampled from big name artists.
Hmm.
So you'd think to yourself, well, that must not take a lot of effort, but it still sounds good. It still sounds like it was like expertly composed. And again, I can't do it justice until you actually sit down with it to sort of understand, because it's interesting, it's experimental. I could name off all these buzzwords all day, but I'm biased, so
No, no, I understand that. And I was talking to someone this weekend, and he said that we used to define musical instruments by things with strings
mhm,
and um, with keyboards or the guitars or pianos or other stringed instruments, and then you have orchestra instruments and things. He says, and now then there is a set of music that it's all from a computer, and it is just as much a valid musical instrument as your 12-string guitar or a violin or any other instrument. So I hear that a little bit in your discussion, right? Like
right.
that is the instrument you can use to help build and compose your musical
Right,
output.
right. Now, the dichotomy of that is very interesting from a personal standpoint, for me at least, because if you were to put a gun to my head and say, traditional music or computerized music, I'd say traditional music all the way. Um, that's just my personal opinion. The reason why I have such a fondness over computerized compositions is because that is what allowed me to not only have my start in music, but also sort of have my own personal redemption.
Yeah.
I've made more tracks since the whole I guess you could say incident.
Hmm.
It was a learning experience for me. It really was back in November.
Yeah.
And having that, had it not been for that, I don't think I would have appreciated the whole composition element of music making.
Hmm.
Even though it's done on GarageBand, I can look at a track that I've done and say, while simplistic, I'm walking away content about what I've put together.
Has has music always been part of your process, though, as you wrote and as you drew, like
Yes.
when you were writing,
Mhm.
novels or, you know, stories or poetry or whatever kind of prose you're writing, or when you're drawing, was there
Definitely.
music part of that background, more traditional or more a little bit of both?
A little bit of both. It was dependent on what genre I was tackling at the time. Now, if you're, I would say music fueled a lot of how the overall composition of the picture or
Hmm.
the tone of story factored out. If I needed to listen to something calm and soothing because I was writing or illustrating a calm or soothing scene, it worked miles better than listening to just a full on guitar riff, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It does.
Like it puts you in the right headspace.
Hmm. Is and this is okay if you don't have an answer, but is there a version of comfort food that you would call comfort music? That there is an album or a song or a set of, songs that are a safety net or a sense of comfort for you?
Yes. Um, I will say though, I can actually name an album point blank. Though I will give you a disclaimer in advance. It is very much a double-edged sword because while comforting, it can most times be unsettling.
Okay.
It's one of those albums that you kind of have to go into it with the headspace of either I have no idea what this is, and in that case, you're in for a treat, or I know exactly what that album is, and I'm here to experience it with a new perspective. And that album is The Caretakers' Everywhere at the End of Time.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, if you haven't heard of this album,
I have not,
I
but
would
I'm an
advise you
old man.
I would advise you to listen to it. It is a
Mhm.
7-hour album.
Oh,
Yes. This album has been a cornerstone for me in not only music composition, but genuine and general appreciation of the world around me. One look into the comments, and you'll know that something's up where people are posting lengthy paragraph discussions about personal matters pertaining to growing old. The album, in essence, is essentially uh, focused primarily on dementia and Alzheimer's
okay.
and the degradation of a human life, of one human's mind. And knowing that music can be such a powerful factor in the recollection potentially and the general memory acquisition of it, it's when I listened to it for the first time, like most people, I got emotional.
Hmm.
My family has a history of Alzheimer's, and knowing that, knowing after a recent death in the family, knowing the knowing that degradation in such a way without actually experiencing it, it was powerful to say the least. Having that solace in understanding the in understandable, having solace in understanding what otherwise can't be understood, you could say, that speaks volumes.
What's interesting is I'm pulling this up, um, and this is probably not connected at all, but I'm a little reminded of the in and of itself the one man play that just recently was released on Hulu.
Hmm.
I don't know if you've heard of it.
I have and I haven't.
Okay. It is a one-man play, and I will go with what everyone else says. As little of you knowing about it is better for you when you go into it. But basically, this is a one-man story talking about identity and identity of himself and how other people see him and how you
Hmm.
see yourself. And it is a very interesting 90-minute show that and I remember I did not know this, but um, when it recently came on, Penn Sunday School, or Penn Gillette does a twice a week podcast. And they talked about it being on Hulu, and they actually linked to like 4 or 5 years ago where he was on the podcast and he says, I just saw the best magic show I've ever seen. And it's like no other magic show I've ever seen. And it's this play called In of Itself. And and you don't even know it is much more than just a new way to show magic. It is a different kind of show. And so
Hmm.
looking at this everywhere at the time, and I just pulled up the Wikipedia, thing, and talking about it, it does sound something that would be. I can see how that, depending on your mood, this is where I want to be challenged. I want to be comforted. Um, I have a little bit of feeling of that when Brian Wilson finished Smile. He had abandoned Smile when he was with the Beach Boys.
Right.
And then he later came back as an adult and finished the album. And when I listen to that album now, I find it very challenging at times and very creative and a very different journey
Hmm.
versus Loving Pet Sounds or a Springsteen album. It isn't that kind of it's a different kind of music that makes me think a different way. So that's interesting you're sharing that. I will certainly have to check that out.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
It is an album that it's a trip.
Yeah.
I'll definitely tell you that.
That's interesting. Sebastian, we've gone an hour, and I feel like we've just got started. But for the sake of what should I have asked you that I have not?
To tell you the truth, I think that this was, in all honesty, a perfect conversation and the perfect ending. Um, Ending off with this topic,
Mhm.
Um, to tell you the truth, I mean, you sent me a list of possible questions, and even though I want to say a third of those were actually asked, this conversation it was everything promised and more.
Well,
I absolutely enjoyed it.
well, thank you. I appreciate that, Sebastian. I will. This will be one of the times when I get off, and I know you're on Instagram. You're not on Twitter,
Yeah,
but
Twitter is kind of a war zone, but
yeah, it
Instagram is where you can
is.
find me.
But this will be one of the times where when we finish our conversation, I will go on Twitter and I will say, "Oh my God, I just had the most interesting discussion with Sebastian Schug,"
Oh, thank you.
and and this is one of those things where I just it's interesting to kind of go down these roads and discuss the topics. And um, so thank you for sharing for yourself. Thank you of enjoying the conversation. I appreciate it, but I can't let you go till I ask you the Mary question. And I
Okay.
did give you the notes before. So, but those of you, let's say you're a fan of Sebastian's or you're a friend or family, and you're like, what the hell is the Mary question? Jay Armstrong is an honors English teacher in the Philadelphia area. He just recently retired, but
Hmm.
for many years, he would take his honors English class that's composed of seniors, and they would spend 2 days taking the Bruce Springsteen song Thunder Road and breaking it apart, the lyrics, and treating it as a poem. They discuss the imagery that Bruce uses, the themes, and they will often compare it to Robert Frost poetry. And then at the end of the 2 days, they ask the question, does Mary get in the car? So, Sebastian, that is your question. Does Mary get in the car at the end of Thunder Road?
Well, I, I mean, look, I'm not gonna BS you here. You asked me the question in the email, and immediately I was like, okay, this is something that I need to look up, and I did. Looking at it with a fresh perspective now, because I just pulled it up again, and I had this whole answer prepared. Because I was looking at the lyrics and how they all fit together and everything. Does Mary climb into the car? I have to ask the question of is what is what's promised at the other side of getting in the car better than the situation she's in now?
Good
Because
question.
you look at the lyrics, right? Your graduation gown lies in rags at their feet, and in the lonely cool before dawn, it's a town full of losers, and I'm pulling out of here to win. I'm cherry picking here.
No, I understand.
I think the question isn't so much does Mary get in the car, it's the question of is the situation of hers so damn horrid that getting in the car without the promise of what's going to happen next going to be better than the situation that she's currently in by comparison. Does she climb in? I sure hope so.
Okay.
What's your opinion on it?
Um, so I am an optimistic, and I grew up. I make the joke, and it's not totally untrue. I grew up watching Disney movies,
Mm-hmm.
and I believe in happily ever after. So of course she gets
Okay,
in the car, right?
because
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I was gonna say my original perspective was actually pessimistic, or more so realistic, where it was like
Yes.
it's like Mary, look, things may be going wrong. Okay, but you have to be independent in your decision making here. So like what are you doing climbing in this car? And I took it at face value of like here's a fresh new opportunity. It's almost like selling your soul to the devil where you make a decision just to get out of a crappy circumstance, thinking that this is going to lead you on the path of something better than whatever is comparable to what's happening right now. When in reality, giving it some time and letting the situation play out, you find that it's not as bad as you initially think it is. Now I'm looking at it with a fresh perspective, and I realize, well, things can't get any worse for her.
Okay. Sure.
You know what I mean? So I feel like that there's a fine line that you can walk down of, Mary, just kind of tough it out. But at the end of the day, I hope the decision of what she's making, if she does decide to climb into the car, it's worth it, you know? If he's pulling out of there to win, he better.
So what I find interesting, and this has become my version of Actor Studio, inside the Actor Studio, those 6 questions he asked, right? And someone said that like this has become your way, and I do. I ask this question to everyone, whether a Springsteen fan or not, and like yourself, I give you in advance. Listen to the song, read the song.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in fact, I have 2 episodes. I have a episode where I took about 40 or 50 answers and put them all together. And then I had Jay join me because Jay's been on the show a couple of times, and then I had Jay join me after listening to everyone's answers and him talk about the answers. And that's why I give him credit every time. Like this is his question
Mm-hmm.
I took. 60% roughly say yes, 40% say no.
Hmm.
So it saying no, she doesn't get in the car is not that unusual of an answer. It is. We get the um, we get some female guest who take it as Bruce Springsteen is asking me to get the car. Hell yes, I'm getting in the car with him, right? um, you know, I just emailed you the most unique answer. Bex Goss was a podcaster, and her podcast is all about putting college level analysis on children entertainment,
Hmm.
because her and her husband have toddlers and they have to watch the same thing over and over and over again. So just to
Right.
remain sane, they kind of had this. And she wrote it as if, this was a murder mystery. And if, oh my God, if Mary gets in the car, she's going to end up dead. And she explains why. And I mailed you those notes. Um, you know, um, I have a couple of favorite answers. One guy said that, and if you're not a Springsteen fan, you won't get the beauty of this, but um, in this album, Western Stars, which is the album before his next to last album, there's a song called Moonlight Motel, which ends with the guy pouring a shot out in memory of his past bride.
Hmm.
And the guy said that yes, they get in the car, they drive all the way to California, they spend their life together, and Moonlight Motel is the end of their life. He is mourning Mary's passing. Okay,
Mm.
that's a pretty damn good answer. Um, One of my favorites is the guy said it depends. Like, okay, go ahead. I want to hear more. He said when Bruce and the band play it, she gets in the car because the song ends with Clarence's, you know, saxophone solo, or now then Jake's. The full band plays it off, and it's one of triumph. They are in the car, they're driving off, they are going to conquer the world. When he does it solo, the end of it is him just kind of humming and playing silently at the end. She doesn't get in the car, and that's him driving off by himself, sad that she didn't join him. And I'm like, okay, that's effing brilliant, depending on it. So
Right.
we always have fun with it, and I love your answer. This is truly one of those where there is no right answer. It is instead of Schrodinger's cat, it's Schrodinger's Mary, right?
Yeah.
It is just depending on what you want. And, many people have, and I can't tell you how often, Sebastian, someone has hung up and like a day or two later, Jesse, I have another thought. Can I record you and you tax that in?
Oh
Like, I'm like,
no.
yeah, no, I'd love that. So this is great. All right. So we've already established that you're not on Twitter, but you are on Instagram. Tell people how to reach you, websites, whatever you want. Promote away, my friend.
Sounds great. Feel free to look me up on www.sebastianrshug.com. Now, I will say that, because Sebastian Schug Publishing has gone underground, you could say, it's more or less a landing page. That
Yeah.
is something that I would actually, now that I think about it, that's a website that you could go to. However, I am most active actually on YouTube, where I upload daily narrations on my YouTube channel, Seabass. That's Seabass, spelled and sounded exactly like the fish. I'm also a member of the joint YouTube channel. It's all subjective. We just posted a new video today about streetwear. So that was fun. You can also find me on a myriad of other podcasts, such as Mars on Life, co hosted with Ryan Mancini. There, we do a deep dive on the various miscellaneous art stuffs in the greater Los Angeles area. There's also Shugsy Storytime, which is essentially just an audio archive of my YouTube channel. There's a ton of stuff that you could look up.
Well, I will tell you, um, if you're open to it, I want you to come back on the show and talk about some of the other podcasts, talk about future things when you're going. I would love to have you back on.
Please, I
I've
would I would be more than happy to.
I have had a great time talking to you. This has been wonderful, and I certainly hope continued success. And keep fighting the good fight, my friend, as we all try to get through this pandemic.
Thank you. You as well.
All right, so listeners, you go check out his YouTube channel. I will include a link in the show notes. Please let us know what you think. For now, though, remember to social distance. Remember to wash your hands. Remember to wear a mask. Let's all be good to each other because that's the only way we're going to get through this. And for now, take care, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.
Take care.
Thank you to my patrons who help support the show. It is greatly appreciated. I want to thank Betsy Hodges, Levi Petrie, Elizabeth Bronson, Stephen Malio, Holly Mack, Steve Rogers, Dale Hosick, Terry Smith, Anna Lynn, Chris Bloom, and my first patron, Mary Thomas. Thank you guys so much for all the love and support you give me.
You just heard the fun talking, hard rocking, music loving, album ranking, fan thinking, joy spreading, lyric reading, story sharing podcast that is the one, the only Set Listing Bruce. Set Listing Bruce is part of the Southgate Media podcast group. The theme for Set Listing Bruce was written by David Rosen, used by permission.